Welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. My name is Sean. I'm the festival's artistic director. We are broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. And on behalf of our partners at Library and Archives Canada and the Ottawa Public Library, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's launch for Love After the End. It's hard to imagine, but in an alternate universe, this evening would have been the opening night of the festival's fall edition, and we would perhaps be gathered in person to kick off a week-long celebration. While we are missing the community contact and the chance conversations and interactions that used to be such an important part of our lives, I'm profoundly grateful that we are still in a position to celebrate great writing, and tonight, to imagine what tomorrow might bring. One of our community partners, Quart, the Ottawa Queer Arts Collective, wanted us to highlight the work of the Association of Seven Generations. A7G is an Indigenous-owned, grassroots, youth-led, youth-driven, nonprofit organization focused on cultural support and empowerment programs for Indigenous youth. This fall and winter, A7G are connecting with youth by offering virtual language lessons on Thursdays and virtual youth gatherings for Indigenous youth on Fridays. Please go to a7g.ca for more resources and links. I also want to thank you all for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby or online who would be more than happy to sell you a copy of this book, as well as work by any of the authors we've been lucky enough to connect with virtually this season. We've seen now how hundreds of years of colonial violence continues to dehumanize and disenfranchise Indigenous communities, how that legacy continues to destroy the environment, how the smallest concession to Indigenous sovereignty leads to howls of protest, like we're seeing with the lobster fishery. But we are also now seeing that the future, if there is to be one, will not be a Jetson-style monoculture of extractive capitalism and 1950s cis-het norms. It's going to be a lot more interesting than that. I'm so grateful to be playing a small part in welcoming this amazing anthology into the world. Our host tonight is Joshua Whitehead, who is the editor of Love After the End. This is Joshua's third appearance at the festival. We were lucky to host him as a poet with Full Metal Indigiqueerly, then as a novelist with Jonny Appleseed, and tonight we are blessed to have him back, this time as an editor and our host. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to Joshua Whitehead.
Hi, everybody. I just want to first and foremost thank Ottawa Writers Fest for having me again. I'm sad we can't be all visiting in the lovely little city that you have, but this is also works just as fine, I think. I'm so happy and honored to be here with three of my amazing contributors, Nazma Tom, Jay Simpson, and Adam Garnet Jones, who I'll be introducing momentarily. So what we're going to do for tonight is I'll introduce each of my contributors. They'll be offering you a short sampling of the reading, something sweet, something supple to take home with you. And then we'll be jumping into a discussion between us four, but we'd love to hear questions from you. So if you can see on your Zoom, there's a little Q&A box just on the bottom. If you want to click that, if you have any questions, pop them in there. I'll see them, and hopefully we'll get to some, if not all of those tonight. So bring your questions as they come, throw them at me. So it's my great honor to be introducing all three of these writers. And first and foremost, I would like to introduce Nazma Tom, who's a Dene and a somatic practitioner. They support individuals and groups through a process of embodied transformation using a combination of conversation, breathwork, new skills, bodywork, and gestures. Their work aims to humanize and reconnect us to ourselves, to each other, and to our land. In between working with individuals and groups, they do their best to capture poems and short stories haunting them at all hours of the day. And it's a great honor again to be bringing Nazbah here, reading from their story, Nameless. So I'll hand it over.
Thank you so much, Joshua. And thank you so much to the Ottawa Writers Festival to bring us in and to have us share our writing with all of you. So I'm reading from my short story called Nameless. And this particular piece here is around an elder, a Sanhashke. She's teaching who's her apprentice how to travel, as I call it. So, and it's really just about collapsing time and space here. So I'll just read a little excerpt here, and hopefully you like it. Okay, let's begin. Get comfortable in your chair. Ready? She looked right into Ge's eyes with her eyebrows raised. Ge nodded and took in a deep breath. Oh, the first thing we will do is slow everything down with our breath and attention. She slowly raised her hand from her lap to the height of her head with an in-breath and lowered her hand with an even slower out-breath. She did this for 10 minutes. All the while, found themselves getting sleepier and sleepier. Try to stay in both the here and now and the dream world. That is the doorway. With eyes half closed and body half present, nodded their head slowly and followed Asahashke's hand rising and falling. As her hand slowed down even more, she started asking them questions. Where are we now? Sitting in a truck, playing with some keys, or do you see me? You're off to the left side of me. What am I wearing? Let their eyes close to concentrate more. You have on gray pants, light brown or a cream-colored shirt, and a jacket. What else do you see? The inside of the truck, the keys in my hand, and we're in front of a house. It's blue and has white trim on the windows with flower boxes underneath the windows. I feel like I know the people in the house. Wait, the image is dissolving away. It's okay. Stay with me. I'll see you inside. Ge's eyes fluttered open, and for a split second saw Asahashke with her hand on the table and her eyes rapidly darting back and forth beneath her eyelids as if in a trance. Asahashke called Ge back into the dream, and Ge followed by closing their eyes. Where are we now? There's a sink to my left and your right. Why can't I see your face? Try not to focus on that too much. I can feel you in the space. Focus on that sensing. Relax yourself a little more. Okay. Am I dreaming? You're traveling now. Keep going. I know we're just outside and now I'm here with you standing in front of me and I still can't see your face, but you have on the same clothes and you have to head out somewhere. This is so strange to tell you that I just dreamt about you while we were traveling. I mean, we're traveling together. I'm following you. They're the same. The only difference is we know how to do this on purpose. I'm going to go now, and you'll wake up soon.
Thank you. I was just rereading this before, like rereading everyone's, and it's just so beautiful to hear it in your voices. Oh, I can't wait to talk about this piece. I got lots to say. And also that's why I was just like laughing at the Instagram pic that was on, and then you're like perfect little setup in the corner. So say hi to Catherine Hernandez for me.
I will. Yeah, she's actually watching right here. Joshua says hi.
I had to out you a little bit. Next, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Jay Simpson, who I haven't seen in a minute. So I'm so excited to be like virtually reconnecting in this space and to see your beautiful face. So Jay Simpson is an OG Cree Soto Indigiqueer whose roots hail from the Sapoteweak, Gisigoose, and Squanin Cree nations. They are published in several magazines, including Poetry is Dead, This Magazine, Prism International, Sad Mag, Guts, Subterranean Grain, and Room. They are in 2 Arsenal Paul Press anthologies, Hustling Verse 2019 and Love After the End this year. Their newest book, which is so exciting that it's out in the world now, It Was Never Going to Be Okay, just came out with Nightwood Edition, so please do check that out. And it's, yeah, my great honor to bring to the stage the inevitable and the lovely and the majestic Jay.
Anine, so good to see you. Your hair is so long since I saw you last year at Banff. That was quite a journey where you took me to the ER.
Oh yeah, it's been a minute.
It's been a minute. Oh my God. I'm starstruck by the panelists and also people in the audience. I miss in-person events so much. So this, I'm going to read a little bit of the arc of the turtle's back. Dagib comes home in a transport van when I'm out among the prairie fire in Odemum, collecting the sweet and small hearts for preserves. She looks good, hair pressed and cheeks peach with powder. Manadu, how I miss using blush, but how wasteful it is for me to crush these plants and to die to do so. Dagib has this urgency, this drive, and begs us to pack up, telling us to gather only necessities and to leave the supplies and loved things behind. Dagib checks her phone constantly, breathes a sigh of relief when it only took us 20 minutes to gather our lives all up in 2 small suitcases, and groans when I bring my bundle, hand drum and all. Neminson, sister, come on, we don't have time for this. The convoy is ready to leave and we're 6 hours to the city, she urges. I tut at her as I pull down the photo of Kokowa from the wall to put in the bundle bag. Kokowa didn't return home after 5 generations of displacement and kidnapping for you to rush us out of here, I snap at her. Kokowa didn't run away from the reserve at the age of 14 to go to the city to experiment with strangers and figure out their gender identity. Dagib waves her arm in a circle at my body, rushing me out the door. I let the words sting as Gwywydyn and Ash take their seats in the middle of the van, Axel getting in behind them looking concerned. The driver is youngish, from 6 by the looks of it. He places a hand on top of Dagib's, shaking one as she slides into the front. I take a seat beside Axel. He slips his hand atop of my lap and I let him kiss my shoulder. We meet up at the convoy at Auntie Lee's. There's a team there for us. I can fill you in once we're there, but for now, please have faith in me, sister, Dagib states simply, forcing us into complacency, which by now we're used to out of fear of the new Indian agents stealing our bodies for their mining and settlement camps off-planet. The truck rumbles, unaccustomed to the unpaved roads of the reservation. Gwywydyn grumbles about Zergraphic novel collection and being awake. Zay is usually asleep during the day, especially in the heat of July. The van's air conditioning is on full blast and I can see Dagib still perspiring. Something else is up. Why go to the city? Metropolises weren't exactly the safest place for us as a very queer and very Indigenous family trying to hide from the new Indian agents. Auntie Lee's convenience store is ahead of us, attached to the band office and the hall. I see similar looking vans idling with business looking Indigenous folks standing nearby, having what I can only describe as disconcerting looks on their faces. As our van pulls up, Dagib is already opening the door, shooting a warning glare at me, half asserting her dominance and half asking me to stay put. She should know better by now. Kokowa did raise both of us.
Thank you, Jay. Again, it's just so beautiful to hear in your voices. There's an insult in your story where your main character says if they get them mad enough that they're going to drop a house on them. And I was like, I need to bring that into my regular everyday lexicon. It's quite a threat. There's also a scene where your main character is wearing the moon medallion, the moon cycle medallion. And that's like the staple, I think, of Jay. When I first met you, you had that on. So when I see that, I always picture you. So thank you. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Adam Garnet Jones. Adam is Cree, Métis, and Danish, and a two-spirit screenwriter, a director, a bead worker, and a novelist from Edmonton. And let me just say, I'm also wearing Adam's beadwork that he made for me, which got a bunch of memes on like Instagram. People be like, that's a weird bead. And I was like, this is one of my favorite medallions. So wonderful beadwork artist. Adam came into his own as a filmmaker with the release of his film feature Fire Song at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2015. Fire Song went on to win the Audience Choice Award at the Imaginative before picking up 3 more Audience Choice Awards and 2 jury prizes for Best Film at other festivals. Before going into production, the script for Fire Song won the Writers Guild of Canada's Jim Burt Screenwriting Prize. Adam is now focusing on writing fiction and creating custom beadwork. Again, I need to shout that out. Primarily for Indigenous artists, and also runs a beadwork, BYOB, Bring Your Own Beads, a beadwork group. So do check that out. Again, I'm so happy to have us all here. Adam Garnet Jones, folks.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you. It's a shout out to my beadwork group. I was actually just in the group earlier tonight because I accidentally double booked myself. It's the times we live in. So I guess I will just begin by reading my piece. It was great to hear the last two pieces. Mine also begins with a leaving. So this is from the beginning of the story. When we packed to leave for the very last time, it didn't feel like the end. There was too much to think about. The three of us took our last steps out the door and into the smog-glazed air of the city. I gave a nod to the round-bellied man stripping siding from the house, a warning that he and his crew of city salvage workers had better stay outside until they were good and gone. I took Asetsuan's hand and pulled her past the men. Her little legs fluttered in double time to keep up. All down the street, she kept twisting her head around to look as if the house would still be hers as long as she held it in sight. Thora was way ahead of us. Strident fear propelled her beyond our reach. I glanced back before we turned the corner. Silvery trunks of maples, all dead since last year, stood like gravestones in front of the empty houses. Where will we bury our dead in the new world, I wondered. The salvage crew disappeared into our house with heavy plastic bags and crowbars. Thora was a block away, flapping her hands for us to hurry up. I started skipping, dragging Asetsuan behind me until we caught up. Thora maintained her pace, groaning about the wobbling left wheel of her luggage. She cursed the day's early heat and fretted that the bottles of filtered water wouldn't last until we arrived. I made sympathetic sounds as required. The airing of small complaints was how she mapped her world, as if enumerating the flaws in her surroundings reminded her that she was still alive and that time continued to pass her by. My own misgivings about Thora had long since given way to a kind of gratitude. The daily pattern of her moans, clicks, and sighs were a comfort. A rhythm that bound our days together. Years ago, if someone saw us taking off down the street like this, luggage in hand, they would have assumed that we were hitting the road for a weekend in Montreal or taking a trip out west, perhaps. But flying wasn't something that regular people could do anymore. The only ones to take off now, suitcases in hand, were taking flight, escaping Earth. Over the past 2 years, information about the New World had come to us without warning in massive, intermittent data dumps. News organizations and citizen scientists mined it all for scraps that might seem important or interesting to the general public. From them, we learned that, on average, the weather on the New World would be 2 degrees colder than Earth. We heard that the ocean currents were different, even though the land masses of both planets were near mirror images of one another. Pundits and politicians used vague, searching metaphors, telling us over and over again that the planets were like identical twins, at once the same and altogether different. Twins share a womb, I thought. They grow from the same mother. I waited for the politicians and scientists to concede the existence of a grand mother of universes, but no such announcement came. Instead, we learned that in the New World, a tottering penguin-like bird, but with enormous blue eyes like polished stones, lives at the South Pole. They also told us that, although many primates occupy the twin planet, no humans could be found. None of the species they had encountered showed any evidence that they possessed intelligence or self-awareness beyond that which could be expected from a crow or a dog. But crows have funerals, I remembered. Dogs will always find their way home. Still, the scientists were keen to report that the planet was without buildings, monuments, or systems of writing. No history at all. A miracle. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, I'm so excited to jump into conversation with all of you. So let's get to like gabbing like aunties.
The best part.
Yeah, I think so. It's like we're in the bingo hall. We're about to go get a Pepsi and a hot dog, bacon
Nice.
chips.
$5 combo.
Exactly. Maybe some 50-50s. So it's interesting. So each of your stories have worlds that are in various different like times and spaces of collapse. Nazbah, your community here has like had to go underground after a world war. Adam and Jay, both of your worlds are on the edge of deterioration from extraction, from global warming, and everything else that kind of comes with those systemic issues. Whereas, and in Jay's story, your characters leave Earth, and in Adam's, your characters choose to stay, and then in Nazbah's, yours is moving in between generations. So like, I'm sure we're all aware that the world is burning, dying right now. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit about, like what does utopia mean for you or your characters? Like, why did you put them into these scenarios or situations that you did? Or what does utopia mean to you even? Yeah.
It's funny, I don't know what everybody's like status in this book is, but I saw the call for this book on Facebook for pitches, and I had written a novel and I didn't have any short stories, and I was like, oh, okay, like I can think about this. Like, what would my take on a fantasy utopia something be? And I love speculative fiction, and was thinking a lot about how a lot of it is about creating new worlds and thinking about new worlds and different places, and about humanity moving from one place to another. And that for me really led to just thinking about how much we depend on humanity, and I think that maybe European people depend on the idea of like always going somewhere new. Even like Western narratives, like the classic Western, depends on the idea of like expanding west into this like unknown, uninhabited territory, and how that's always at the expense of indigenous peoples. And so thinking about that in terms of like a fantasy science fiction context, that created a question for me about like the ethics of an indigenous person becoming a colonizer potentially, and how they would think through that. And so anyway, that's kind of how I arrived at that question of just thinking like, where is my place, and maybe where is all of our places in this kind of writing, which is like, I think that fantasy writing and speculative fiction has a tendency toward colonialism, and so to think about that and unpack that, it was a good time.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just preface too. So Love After the End is actually a second iteration of this book. The first was with the now closed Bedside Press. So I came into this already, the contributors were already chosen. I was just the editor. The press went under, and then we spearheaded it to Arsenal, who, thank you so much for giving this a new home. But when I was approached, so this is also a secondary inclusion into this maybe series of Indigiqueer 2SQ speculative fiction. Originally, it was supposed to be dystopian, and I was like, why are we always writing about dystopias? Look, we live in dystopias. These are speculative fiction stories that sound way too true right now. It's way too real, scarily true. So I wanted to, was like, let's think about utopias. Like, let's think about our joy and our success and our thriving, rather than continually like pursuing like pain or trauma, or like, again, dystopia. Like, we as Indigenous peoples right now is a dystopian present, right? So just as a preface to why I was like interested in your just like ideas around utopia or joy even.
Yeah, I think kind of going off of what Adam was just mentioning about like what does it mean to interrogate, like, and maybe like embodying colonizing, but also to learn to disembody that. And I was thinking about, there's so many times that we're always looking out and to a new place, right? To that person, but not to the folks who are already there. And I think a space that I'm always curious about is what happens if that new terrain is actually within. And then also that new terrain is the lens that often many of us have to leave, right? In order to pursue education, work, partnership, all these things. And I think for many of us, there is such a yearning and a longing to return to those places. And I remember a lecturer at U of T, Dr. Diane Millian, talking about, many of us will never return home. And so our work really is to take care of where we end up, and so, and then also I was thinking about how can we use what's available to us then, if we're not able to physically be home, to then really be in connection, right, with that. So that was sort of my thinking around that. But I think with this, actually, the inspiration for this was just a lot of dreams I had, where they felt so real, they felt so vivid, they were very lucid. And the particular scene that I showed, where as like, oh, you're wearing this and that, my aunt, who's now deceased, actually, that was her. Like, she was in a Zanhashke's position. Like, I dreamt about her after she passed, and it was in someone's trailer back home, and I couldn't see her face, and I knew it was her, and I was like, "Is that you?" And we had a conversation, and and that's a common occurrence for me, is to talk with and communicate with relatives who've passed on, and I was like, there's something here, like there is some sort of collapse happening, and it's happened enough times that I'm like, what's going on, but then I was like, it's also really fun, to imagine, like, oh, if I could write a short story about it, and if it was on purpose that I could do that, and all these things, so it was fun to imagine that, and to really play with that, and then also to really be like, as many Indigenous communities have done, like, they've survived, sadly, so many attempted genocides, that we learn from those experiences, and then we learn how to move through it better the next time. I mean, and there are stories of people from my community who did go into the canyons, into the walls there, to hide from Kit Carson and his army, as he was herding people over to Fort Sumner. That's how they survived, and they were never found. And then there were the ones who did get captured, and they were interned there, and then they came home. So, so there's a lot of collective knowledge there as well. So it's like, yeah, we'll get through this next thing, Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think for myself, it is at times difficult to see a future. And that has shifted tremendously given the nature of what I'm seeing in the next generation that has been safeguarded by folks of our generation and the generation before us, where I now really believe that the kids are okay. And it's in that belief that I began to dream more of a tomorrow where a utopia can exist. And it's been a lot of like self-work also, and like reflecting and contemplating the work of Billy Ray Belcourt, who talks about utopia quite a bit, and the theory of it. And it's really a lot of coping to try to figure out what utopia meant for me. But when I thought of the future I want, it has to be a future that isn't based in pseudo-traditionalism and is based in futurisms that adapt and move like a river would through the land, and how we have to move in that sense. But as Adam said, also with the idea of moving and Europeans wanting to go somewhere else, and that kind of like hiding to stay. In my short story, my main character doesn't want to leave, and it's through not her own choice that she actually is removed. And that was a very intentional decision, because I had a discussion with Rem more so about like leaving, and then she said, she's like, none of my people and I, if given that choice, would ever leave. And I thought about that, and I was like, I just got my home territories back. Like, I returned recently. I met my aunties and my cookums, and heard the language, speaking fluently. I don't think I would leave either if the world was, if there was a choice to go elsewhere. I don't think I would leave either. The only thing is if it was when I was unaware, and I think that was something I had wanted to explore more, and how for utopia, necessity is utmost at times, and it's very frightening.
I love those responses. It's like, and I think that's ingrained in all of your stories, and like thinking about kinship and caretaking for the space as we're discussing here, but also like I think everyone's asking, and more specifically like Adam and Jay, like thinking about the ethics of, do we become colonizers too, or do we enact those kind of systemic powers when we're in spaces, right? Like even being here in Mokinstis or Treaty 7 as a Cree, OG Cree from Treaty 1, I'm also very aware that this is not my home. I'm just a participant and a caretaker in the space, right? And I don't think a lot of folks think about that in the spaces they move around. Like I think of what we do, obviously, as we name our spaces and we recognize the sovereignty of our nations, right? And yeah, so that's just, I love those ideas of like thinking about what utopia means, but also like sometimes the cost or the mourning of a utopia like that in any kind of grand sense. And maybe this too like leads into my next question, which I pose to all three of you. But I think everyone's stories are like, and this is why I was so excited to pair this trio, because I think your stories are all talking to one another. So like Nazbah, your protagonists, they speak to each other across generations, as I said earlier. And Adam, you, even in the naming of your story, The History of the New World, you're talking about history of newness is like past and present, right? As in with Nazbah's. And then in Jay, like yours is about bringing the past, like here Earth, into this new world that your characters are going. Like they literally bring like the 4 medicines, and they have this beautiful greenhouse in these arcs that they're on. And when I was like thinking about this question, I was doing a podcast for Tea House, which is the insurgent architects here at U of C, Larissa Lai runs. And I was editing a podcast with Christos, who was giving an interview. And Christos said this really amazing thing that's haunted me and stuck with me, wherein they narrated that we're always remembering the future. And I thought about that with all three of yours, just like how past and present and futurisms are all kind of braided together. And we're all joking in COVID, like time's a construct, but I think BIPOC folks and queer folks, we know that. It's like, surprise, welcome. So I'm interested, like, can you folks talk a little bit about like temporality and orality? Like how does time or generations or past, present, and future function in your writing? And maybe even if you want to talk about this, how does temporality and orality or time and storytelling function in your lives too?
I don't know.
That's okay too.
That's hard.
I think yeah, you really just like threw us such a hard ball.
Sorry, you're all being tested. I'm grading right now. Or maybe just to simplify, like past and present and future.
I can share
Yeah.
some of my thoughts around that. It's a really good question. And it reminds me of, I introduced myself traditionally once. So, we say, yat she Nazbah in the Shia, a Shin Slom, but Ani Bashin, look at that she the Twitch eating Dashnala. Really just saying, hi, my name's Nazbah. This is my primary clan, which is my mom's clan. So it's maternal, lineage, and then my dad's clan, and then my grandparents on both sides. And a teacher once mentioned, like, oh, you're like a walking genealogy. And I was like, yeah, I suppose I am,
Yeah.
And again, right, it helps locate if you're also another Dene person, that they're like, oh, I know how to relate to you. It doesn't matter where we are, right? And then that's how you relate to them. And so you end up, even if you're, a little kid, you're someone's parent, or a grandparent, or you end up becoming, so all the things. So that's, I think, one way that we're already taught that generations like sort of go back and forth, there's an expansion contraction of it. In the work I do, when you talk about we're always remembering the future, or wait, was it history you said?
Yeah, Christos said we're always remembering the future.
That's right. So the work I do as a somatics practitioner, one of the, like, our treatment plan, right, that we how that gets developed is actually through what we call a commitment. So it's like your vision for the future, like where you want to be, right? You imagine it. And so in all the practices you do, you're actually remembering why you're doing those practices to get to where you want to get to. Right. So I guess in that way, there's a practicing into the future. You're remembering the future all the time, right? Because you know where you've come from, that you're like, there's some skills there, but also I need new skills to get to this other place, right? So there's that happening already. And then even just the work I do with people, again, as a practitioner, we play with time and space all the time, that you're really with all the iterations of that person all the time. That's who is driving their life until they learn to drive, right? Until they learn to be like in charge of themselves a bit more, right? They learn the skills to do that. And so with that, it's almost like, not, like, let's say you were my person that I was working with, Joshua. It's like Joshua and then little Joshua, and then what we know about intergenerational trauma, it's like, and then your ancestors, right? And then what kind of ancestor do you want to be? Right. So all those things we're holding all the time. Yeah. So, and then there's just all the layers within yourself that we're holding as well. So I feel like I time travel all the time in my work. And then that really influences the writing I do. And it really gives me a sense of also, how do I orient where I am now? Right. Like how do we want to take care of this place that we're in now? And like you're saying, I'm a visitor here as well, Dene from what is currently the Southwest USA. Yeah. So it's I feel like it's always with me, and it was just something that we were told to remember all the time, being walking genealogies.
Oh, I love that frame. I'm like, write that down.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And consistently time traveling. I'm like, yes, let us all be biopunk mutants. But it's a very embodied active thing we do, right?
Yeah.
I definitely agree with Nazbah. Even though I was in foster care, like I knew who my grandmas were, I knew who my grandparents were, being able to name, and recently I've discovered more relations, being able to name myself and my relations going almost to pre-contact is a very beautiful thing. But I have always been a non-linear storyteller. Like, it's just, as a kid, people hated listening to me at first because the tangents I would go on. And even and Evan Ducharme and Emily Riddle in the chat can attest to, when I tell a story, I'm like, pause. For context, we need to go 12 years in the past, and then XYZ. My stories always have little asides and little footnotes. And I'm like, to get the full picture, you need to be here on February 27th, 2013, like at this longitude and latitude. And I just need you to join me for 2 minutes to see, and then we'll come back and then you'll understand why I said this thing at this time. And even in my essays, I always go down that route, and I can't, for the love of me, even in creative writing courses, I could never get out of it. I just couldn't. It was just beyond me. And for a while, teachers and professors just said I was a distracted writer and incapable of telling stories in that way. But now on Netflix, all of the shows are nonlinear storytelling. Like think of The Witcher and like all of these things where it's like the past and the present and it's all intermingling and everyone's loving it, but it's just something that we just know and we just do. And it's like, people ask me how I do it all the time. And I'm like, that's just how my brain thinks. And that's just how it is.
Very true. Like sometimes we're like, something funny happened to me last weekend and like sit down, but first I need to go back to 1492. Right? I also just want to remind folks, if you do have questions, the little Q&A box is on the bottom. Plug them in there if you want. But Adam, did you want to add anything to that? Or
yeah, after my saying that the question is too hard, man, you're such like fully formed and wonderfully developed humans. I was just thinking about the question of temporality and this story, but also just in terms of you know, the life that I've lived and realizing that as a queer person for like a lot of my life, I think that I spent time during my development like removing myself from the timeline, kind of imagining myself as this person who is alone, and in some ways like a person alone without a context, where I'm not going to have I'm not going to have kids. I'm not going to be able to participate in kind of like the structures of like family and cultural life in the way that the world at large is able to. And there's lots of reasons why I, you know, sort of put all of that on myself. And it's maybe through the process of like becoming a parent and raising a small person and getting older, but I just feel like my understanding of time and my temporal sense is changed in such a strange and wonderful way, where I feel like I can, you know, I see my stepdaughter now and I see who she was when she was like a tiny creature, and then I look at her and I see, like, I just so clearly see who she is as a grown person. And I talked to my grandma the other night and she was talking about when she was young, and I just feel like I'm like as I have become a parent, I've kind of like re-entered time and not from any kind of a sense of like having an ego in the way that like people invest in their kids, but just feeling like I have permission to be in the world in a different way and participate in culture and in family in a different way. And that's allowed me to kind of see this incredible circular vision of time in a way that I was never able to do when I was just, you know, trying to stand on my own.
Yeah.
And so writing, I guess, you know, connecting back to your question and, you know, about that sense of time and generations in the story and in all of our stories, I think that's maybe what I was unconsciously tapping into and trying to write about and think about and yeah, just work through while I was writing.
Yeah. Well, I think like the indigenous species in your new world, in your story, right, they're called the mermaids, and they like have this like haunting rhythm that people try to decipher, which basically I think comes down from paraphrasing, but your circle is not round. And we all, I think, write in continuums and in circles, like with Jonny Appleseed. People are like, there's no plot here. I'm like, it's a photo album. But I think that's just how we naturally are, right? And I would even say, like, you know, there's like Indian time, like we show up 30 minutes late. There's queer time, right? And
30? I think that's early for you, Josh.
I know, never mind. Like, who am I kidding? It's like an hour and a half. But I think so. There's like that, like Indian time, queer time, and we're, I think, in the intersection of both. So maybe I'll just ask this as my last question to you folks, but as like queer indigenous folks, trans, indigenous, non-binary, or two-spirited folks, how does that like function in your stories? Because I know, like, with all three of yours, whereas with Jay, you're using Zer pronouns, and with Nazbah's, you add an asterisk before the they, them. And Adam, and yours, I really, Thora, like the kind of wife of your main character M, it's like I just don't like. But thinking about in your piece, like queer folks and relationships between. So yeah, like I think as two-spirited people or queer indigenous folks, trans indigenous folks, like we already embody time. Because one, we're not supposed to be here. Two, we've lost a lot of those kind of what we might consider now queer ways of being within our linguistic systems, right? We're still, I think our communities are still very traumatized by same-sex sexual assault, which enforces homophobia and transphobia and femphobia. Or even thinking about queer history on Turtle Island, which doesn't just go back to, like, you know, the queer rights movement, but our queerness arcs back to originality on this island, right? So like, yeah, we are embodiments, walking genealogies, living vocabularies like that. So I guess what I'm interested in speaking about 2SQness or in gender or sex or sexuality is, yeah, like, what stylistic choices did you make in writing your pieces in terms of trying to empower queer or trans indigeneity?
I think I'll throw in on that one. When I first read like the first anthology at the press that shall not be named,
sorry. Okay, I'm done.
I saw myself in a few of the works for the very first time. And when we shared a picture of a beverage called Vanjie in Toronto, and we were talking about this, Josh, it was bright blue, so questionable. And I was thinking to myself, I was like, if I get this work done on time, like if it, I have a responsibility to ensure that the next generation feels seen and feels heard and feels witnessed and knows that there's a future there for them. So I and as someone who does use they, them pronouns, I had to write it in there. And then also use pronouns that weren't she, he, and they. And I had to use it because I know people with those pronouns. You know, I'm in relationship with these people with these pronouns. And also, as Indigenous people, these pronouns just also aren't ours. They're colonial languages and structures. And as I'm actually working this short story into a novel, I'm now exploring that idea of breaking away from those pronouns as gender representation, because we are only queer in the colonial sense. Pre-contact, we were who we were, and there was no like other about it. We were the storytellers, we were everything and nothing at the same time. And I love that idea of chaos in that sense. And for me, this was an opportunity to ensure that I see the next generation, and I'm here for the next generation. Because as like a young queer Indigenous foster kid, I thought I was all alone. Like I thought I was the only one. Oh my God. And like, obviously we're on a panel with all queer Indians. Like, oh my God, like that is like worlds apart from like, 10 years ago. So
Mhm.
I want to make sure that this work lives long enough, that there are children who just know that they're never alone.
Hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay. Whew.
Mhm.
Yeah, it is revolutionary, I think, that we have this, that we have all three of you and the
Mhm.
contributors here, and that we have like queer and trans and non-binary Indigenous writing in the world, and we have these representations. And the work that you do is so important, and the lives that you like politically live are so necessary. So I can only say like thank you,
Hmm.
and we're
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Jay. Yeah. No. Yeah, that's a good question. It really made me consider the asterisk beside the pronoun, right? The they. And it reminded me of all the ways that in the work I do, like there's an interrupting of a narrative that we do a lot, like a self-talk, something that we've internalized, whether from our families or the society or whatever, in order to cultivate a new narrative, you know. And so I was just reading it through again, and even for me, I was like, oh, this is a bit disruptive, for even for me to see they so many times, just as one of the pronouns that you could put in there.
yeah.
And again, yeah, like agreeing with Jay that it is a colonial, placeholder, I suppose, a colonial narrative. Because I think in many of our cultures, right, like there are gender neutral terms that we use that might not make sense if you aren't, in the context of using them. And then there's so many nicknames we get, and there's so many ways that we get referred to that aren't using pronouns. And they grow with us. So I like how they're constantly changing and growing, right? Like I had all these names growing up, and then I have, the name I have now, and I imagine it'll change in the future. That's just something we can look forward to, is that we're always changing. Um, um, and for folks who are Navajo speakers and readers, or Diné speakers and readers, um, just even the subtle shift of who gets named what would be enough for them to be like, wait a minute, that's not often how we address women, like cis women. Even the word hashke, like that's reserved for cis men, usually uncles who get after all the kiddos, right? And when they get act out of line. So I was like, let's put that on a cis woman's like name and have her be the one doing that, right? So that's an interesting thing. And then also add like in Diné is kin, right? Kinship. And so we know that is genderless, right? You're a grandparent, you're a child, right? You're a caregiver, right? You're an ancestor, all these things. And generally those don't have genders unless you assign them. And if, Diné is also gendered, and also you can go back and forth between the two. Yeah, and that also lets people know how you're identifying yourself too. And also how people identify you, and how they accept you, right? So yeah, I think there's a practice of disrupting a narrative that's in this story. It might be annoying at first, or might be like, okay, I get it that this person's a they, and then also just even having to use a slightly skewed name for someone who wouldn't have that name is also disruptive, I believe. So just all these ways that you can really begin to push back on things that would be considered traditional, right? I always critique what's considered traditional now, because a lot of the strains of it are Christian, are privileging men, cis men are privileging heterosexuality, privileging Christianity, privileging so many things, right? Imperialism, so that we're just, it's important, I think, to really disrupt that. And I'll just end with, my wife and I were on a walk earlier, and some lovely folks put a bunch of messages all up and down our lake walk, like along the pavement there. Just really beautiful reminders to people, right? Like Black Lives Matter, lobster. It's not about the lobsters, it's about genocide. MMIWG2S, ACAB, all those sorts of things. Landlords are parasites, just all these sorts of things. I'm like, yes, you're on stolen land, right? All these things. And I was like, yeah, because folks who normally walk there, they're literally not paying to see that, right? Because we're in a suburb in Scarborough, but you're going to have to see it. And some courageous folks took time out of their day or night, to do that public service, and to really remind everyone to be like, hey, we're still here, right? We're queer, we're Indigenous, we're Black, all these things. And we're going to remind you that, that we're going to fight, and that we're not going anywhere, and I think that also lives in our writing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the question of, well, I don't know how to talk about style, but
you got tons of it though.
Thanks. I think that it was really important for me to think about the idea of having history or not having history, and we're still in such a hangover from modernism, where people want to just clear the land, smash everything down, and start from scratch. And so you talked about not liking the character of Thora in the story, but she's a character who really, I think, as many queer people do, and particularly white queer people, is really empowered by the idea that we can just level everything to the ground and we can build ourselves a new utopia. I think that is something that's really exciting for her. And Thora's partner, M, carries all that history with them and isn't able to just, clear away all that history and start from scratch. And I think that a lot of, I guess, what's at the heart of like the queerness or the indigeneity of that story is just is confronting all of those things with all of that history, all of those ancestors attached consistently through, in every moment that she has, or every moment that they have, they're bringing that knowledge and that history and that experience with them, and that it's impossible to sever those things, even as an idea, even as a fantasy or a dream of the future. You can't leave that history behind.
Oh no, I love this. It's very much, it's like we're umbilically tied to where we come from, the stories we tell, right? The bodies are always intertwined like that. We do have a couple Q&As from the audience. My dear friend Garrett I think this is for Jay, but if you can recall the ingredients of a Vanjie cocktail, please do share.
I do not recall.
Me neither. I just
I've
remember it's very sweet. And we got one here, and this commentator writes, Boujou, within your stories, how does the Indigenous futurisms correlate with our current world's process with two-spirit history or two-spirit visibility, revitalization, and expression? Are things different within your stories? New cultures or traditions and expressions that come full circle from pre-contact systems to Indigenous futurisms? So yeah, thinking about Indigenous futurisms, how does that correlate with the current world that we are situated within? Are things different within your stories?
I think I'll jump in because, and I'll be quick because we have limited time. is at the beginning of my short story. The protagonists who are living in the wilds, as I call it, are surviving by indigenous knowledge purely, and that's how they're staying alive, and that's how they're actually doing much better than a lot of the other folks. But the caveat is that the government is pretty anti-queer, and that's how they aren't forced into some of the other labors that are put onto their other kin. And so it's like a mix of that, but and there's comments on some of the traditions and ceremonies that we typically participate in are no longer because there's just no resources to participate in it. And then there's hinting at the future on this new planet, which I see as a return. But a big thing is like, how do we build a relationship with this land? And the joke is like any relationship, you ask them out. And it's that work is being done, and that relationship is being done, and the bringing over of things as a gift is monumental.
Definitely. And also, I love that. How do we build a relationship with this new world? Such a good little ending line. Yeah, so I did get a little permission to go a little over. There's one more question, but the organizer said, go ahead. This is such a rich conversation. So this is the last one we have, which comes from Glenn. So I can't wait to read this entire anthology. Thank you all. Drawing inspiration from a recent panel of authors discussing queer Black joy, I'd like to know your take on indigiqueer or queer/2S joy as a subversive act or as a tool of political disruption. Thinking about our joy as two-spirit folks, queer Indigenous folks, trans Indigenous folks. I'll just preface, because I remember I was having a conversation with Tennille Campbell, who's a photographer, and her online handle is Sweet Moon Photography. And we were doing the headshots, and she was like, okay, Josh, stop trying to look so stoic and deadly. She's like, it's really important that we see Indigenous joy too. And that was something that I hadn't really, I guess, entertained the idea of always trying to be like steadfast and holding on hard and like wanting to be disruptive, but also like my joy can also be just as disruptive, right?
Mm-hmm. It just reminds me of like all the jokes we tell, right? With friends, especially with people who know your language, you know, like my siblings and I, when we get together, we're just like laughing all the time, and that nourishes me so much, you know. But yeah, I love all the fun memes that come across Facebook, all the ways that we drag aunties and uncles, you know, and all the things they do. And even dragging politicians, you know, using Indigenous humor, right? And we all get it. We're like, oh yeah, like I totally get that that meme that's being put out there. I can't think of one right now, but yeah, I think it comes down to humor, and just given all the ridiculous things that we've had to live through and are living through, like I feel like that's the resilience practice. I think for many of us is really just how do we put that weight down for a bit, have a good laugh at ourselves and others, with each other, you know, and laugh, you know, about, you know, the orange devil down south, and yeah. I feel like, and then you can go back to your world and, you know, really be with the reality of what's there. But yeah, just like I really have such a soft spot for folks who, you know, can tell a good joke and do a good meme and do a good drag of someone. Like that's awesome. So I feel like that's a big part of where my joy is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we can all recall like Indian Baby Yoda. Like that
Yeah,
was everything for me.
I have a
And all
baby
the-
Yoda.
Ah, yes.
Jay
I need to get a
does.
baby Yoda. Oh,
I mean, ooh,
yeah, that's cool.
I love that.
That's cool.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
I just think about, yeah, laughing and eating and fucking. And I just want more
Yep.
Indigenous laughter, eating and fucking in like
Exactly.
everything that we make and everything that we do. And I, you know, have to say that the things that I have made have not had enough of those things in them. And I would love to see more of that in the work that all of us create, because that joy is so important. And when I'm looking at all kinds of content that's coming from our communities, it is like I get the many reasons why this is the case, but it is unfortunate sometimes that joy isn't represented as well as when we walk into a room, into a gathering, and you hear that laughter, you see some like big belly shaking, and you just like, and you just feel good, right? And so, yeah, I look forward to a time when there is a lot more of the many shades of all that in the work that we're making.
I love that trio, all three at the same time. I'm in. Adam, you can write the next bear topping scene for Indigenous lit, or someone can. It's
no, that's on you. You're the only right now. You're the only. I think for queer 2S joy, like I was raised by the aunties in all the halls, right? That is something that precedes me is the laughter. And I always got told as a kid that I had a cookum laugh, and I didn't understand what that meant for a very long time, but I have the same laugh as my mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother, and I think that's disruptive to the narrative that we're sad and we're broken and we're depressed, and like although we look real mean, stoic, and deadly, there are these moments where like I get told all the time, they're like, what are you laughing at? And I was like, you won't get it, Munya. Like you won't get it. Like there's just things you can't explain. And like at Banff, I tried to teach my cohort that Tagai meant until we meet again. And and the other Cree in the room was like, don't you dare. And I was like, Tagai. It's kind of that raunchy, like, like, let's say this awful word means something else. And the ability to laugh and shout and like, is what keeps us alive. And I think what keeps us alive is inherently radical.
Yeah, I love that. And like we were crying, we're laughing, like we have this huge range. And I would say, even thinking about generations and on this, is that even our laughter, it contains multitudes, generational multitudes, right? Like we laugh like our mothers, our grandmothers, we laugh like those bingo hall aunties, we laugh. And that laughter is like a summoning of temporality too, I would even say. I love that. Well, I just want to thank you three so much. Thank you for joining me tonight. Thanks for your stories, your insights, your joy. And I hope we can all cross paths again soon. I do want to thank Ottawa Writers Fest and everyone who's been staying with us and joined us this evening. So thank you for joining us, and to our partners who made this happen, the Ottawa International Writers Festival, Ottawa Public Library, and the Library and Archives Canada. I also do just want to plug the next event with Ottawa Writers Fest is next Monday, October 26th, 7:30 p.m. again, and it will be the 17th annual Bywords John Newlove Poetry Awards ceremony. So stay tuned. Make sure to check out this book, check out their works. Lots of love. All medicine.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Miigwech.
Thank you.
Bye until we meet again.
Yes.
And don't go around saying Tagai.